The knights of the Middle Ages weren't the noble, chivalrous heroes that Hollywood has painted them to be. They were professional killers, men who spent their entire lives perfecting the art of death. These weren't weekend warriors playing at combat. These were individuals who could split a man's skull with a single swing of their sword, who charged into battle knowing that mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Our journey begins with a man who never lost a single combat in his entire career. So William Marshal stands as perhaps the most terrifying tournament champion in medieval history. Born around 1146, William wasn't handed his reputation on a silver platter. He earned it one broken bone at a time. Picture this: you're a knight stepping into the tournament field, and across from you stands William Marshal. You know that in his career he's defeated over 500 opponents. 500! That's not just skill, that's systematic dominance. But here's what made William truly feared. He didn't just win these tournaments, he turned them into profit machines through calculated brutality. Medieval tournaments weren't the pageantry we imagine today. They were massive, chaotic melees where hundreds of armoured knights crashed into each other across fields spanning 9 square kilometres. No rules, no boundaries, just raw, unfiltered violence where death was always one misstep away. William thrived in this environment like a predator in its natural habitat. His tactics were as cunning as they were ruthless. While other knights charged headfirst into the chaos, William would hold back, watching as his opponents exhausted themselves in the initial frenzy. Then, when they were gasping for breath and their sword arms were heavy with fatigue, he would strike. He'd grab the reins of an opponent's horse and drag them from the field, demanding ransom for their freedom. Horse, armour, weapons, everything was forfeit to the man who could outthink and outfight every challenger. But William's reputation wasn't built solely on tournament victories. When real warfare called, he answered with the same lethal efficiency. He served 5 different kings, navigating the treacherous political waters of medieval England, while maintaining his position as the kingdom's most feared warrior. His loyalty was absolute, but his methods were uncompromising. During one campaign, when William was already in his 70s, most knights would have retired to their estates to live out their remaining years in comfort. Not William. He led English forces at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, charging at the front lines with the vigour of a man half his age. The sight of the legendary knight, grey-haired but still deadly, was enough to shatter enemy morale before the battle had truly begun. Moving from England to the sun-scorched battlefields of medieval Spain, we encounter a knight whose very name became synonymous with terror. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known to history as El Cid, represents everything dangerous about medieval warfare, wrapped into one incredibly skilled package. El Cid's rise to power reads like a masterclass in medieval brutality. By age 22, he commanded the royal troops of Castile, but his ambitions stretched far beyond serving any single king. What made El Cid particularly terrifying was his complete disregard for traditional loyalties. Christian or Muslim, it didn't matter to him. He would fight for whoever offered the best terms, switching sides with a cold pragmatism that left his enemies never knowing where he might appear next. This unpredictability became his greatest weapon. Imagine being a medieval commander trying to plan your defences, knowing that the most skilled warrior of the age might be fighting alongside you today and against you tomorrow. El Cid turned warfare into psychological torture, where the fear of facing him was often more devastating than the actual battle. His ultimate achievement came when he carved out his own independent kingdom around Valencia. This wasn't conquest through inheritance or political maneuvering. This was raw, violent expansion where El Cid took what he wanted through superior skill and unmatched ferocity. He collected taxes, administered justice, and ruled through the simple principle that opposing him was a death sentence. The weapons these knights wielded were instruments of horror that modern warfare has struggled to match in terms of personal, visceral impact. The medieval sword wasn't just a piece of metal, it was an extension of the knight's will, capable of cleaving through bone and armour with terrifying efficiency. When Robert the Bruce faced an English knight in single combat at Bannockburn, his battle axe split his opponent's head clean open, demonstrating the crushing power these weapons could deliver in skilled hands. But perhaps even more feared than swords and axes were the crossbows that could punch through the finest armour. These weapons democratised death on the medieval battlefield. A peasant with minimal training could kill the most elite knight with a single bolt. King Richard the Lionheart himself fell to a crossbow, shot by a young French defender who barely knew how to use the weapon properly. The combination of devastating weapons, brutal tactics, and men willing to use both without hesitation created a class of warriors unlike anything the world had seen before or since. These weren't soldiers following orders, they were apex predators who had turned killing into an art form. The tournaments where many of these knights honed their skills were bloodbaths disguised as entertainment. Knights would charge at each other with war lances, the same weapons used to kill on actual battlefields. Broken bones were common, missing teeth were expected, and death, while not the goal, was always a possibility lurking behind every charge. What separated the truly feared knights from mere warriors was their ability to weaponize fear itself. Take Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince. His name alone could clear French villages before his army even appeared on the horizon. Edward perfected a military strategy called chevauchée, which wasn't just about winning battles. It was about breaking the will of entire populations through systematic terror. Picture French peasants working their fields when word spreads that the Black Prince is coming. They know what that means. Villages will burn, crops will be destroyed, and anyone who resists will face a death so brutal it serves as a warning to others. Edward's campaigns across France weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated psychological warfare designed to make resistance seem hopeless. The most chilling example came at Limoges in 1370. When the city dared to rebel against English rule, Edward's response was swift and merciless. His forces stormed the walls, and what followed was a massacre that shocked even hardened medieval chroniclers. Hundreds of civilians were cut down in the streets, their bodies left as a message to any other city considering defiance. This wasn't the heat of battle. This was cold, deliberate terror used as a tool of governance. But Edward's reputation wasn't built solely on brutality against civilians. On the battlefield, he was equally devastating. At just 16 years old, he commanded a division at the Battle of Crécy, where English longbowmen turned French knights into pincushions. Wave after wave of armoured cavalry charged the English lines, only to be cut down by arrows that punched through their finest armour like paper. Edward stood calm in the chaos, directing the slaughter with the composure of a seasoned commander, decades his senior. When his father, King Edward III, was asked to send reinforcements to help his young son, the king's response was chilling in its confidence. "Let the boy win his spurs," he said, watching as his teenage son orchestrated the destruction of French chivalry. The weapons these knights mastered were evolving into ever more efficient killing machines. The longsword, wielded with both hands, could deliver crushing blows that shattered bones even through chainmail. But it was the technique behind the weapon that truly mattered. These knights spent years perfecting strikes that could find the gaps in armour, targeting the neck, armpits, and joints where even the finest protection was vulnerable. Medieval combat wasn't about wild swinging and hoping for the best. It was precision violence where every movement was calculated to maximise damage. Knights learned to use their opponent's weight against them, to turn defensive moves into deadly counters, to read the subtle shifts in stance that telegraphed the next attack. Training began in childhood and never truly ended. Young boys destined for knighthood were sent away from home to learn not just combat skills, but the mental fortitude required to kill without hesitation. They practiced on wooden posts until their hands bled, rode horses until they could maneuver in full armour as naturally as walking, and studied the art of war like scholars studied texts. The psychological toll of this training created warriors who were fundamentally different from ordinary men. They developed an almost supernatural calm in the face of violence, an ability to make life and death decisions in split seconds while chaos raged around them. This mental conditioning was perhaps their most dangerous weapon of all. Consider the mindset required to charge full speed at another armoured knight, knowing that one of you likely wouldn't survive the encounter. These weren't desperate men with nothing to lose. These were professionals who had calculated the risks and decided that victory was worth dying for. That level of cold determination was more terrifying to their enemies than any sword or lance. The tournament circuit that produced many of these legendary warriors was a travelling showcase of violence that attracted knights from across Europe. Imagine a modern mixed martial arts tournament, but with weapons designed to kill and armour that sometimes failed at the worst possible moment. Knights would follow these tournaments from town to town, building their reputations and their fortunes through systematic violence. The prize money was substantial, but the real reward was reputation. A knight who consistently performed well in tournaments would attract the attention of kings and nobles looking for military commanders. Success in these violent spectacles was a pathway to political power and social advancement that couldn't be achieved any other way. But tournaments also served a darker purpose. They were testing grounds where knights could experiment with new techniques for killing their fellow man. Tactics developed in tournament melees were refined and perfected for use on actual battlefields. The line between sport and warfare was so thin as to be almost meaningless. What made these medieval killing machines truly terrifying was their combination of individual skill and collective organization. A single knight was dangerous enough, but when dozens or hundreds of them fought together, they became an unstoppable force that could reshape the political landscape of entire kingdoms. Their legacy extends far beyond their own lifetimes. The fear they inspired became a tool of governance that lasted for generations. Long after individual knights had died, their reputations continued to influence political decisions and military strategies. The threat of facing such warriors was often enough to end conflicts before they began, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one you never have to use. These knights weren't just warriors, they were architects of terror who understood that fear could conquer kingdoms faster than armies. From William Marshal's undefeated tournament reign to Elchid's ruthless pragmatism, from the Black Prince's calculated brutality to the systematic violence of medieval combat, these men forged legends through blood and steel. Their legacy reminds us that behind every romanticized tale of chivalry lies a darker truth about the men who shaped history through sheer, uncompromising violence.